Hi, I'm Mari.
Hello, Mari.
We read that you were a Vista
Oh, no,
volunteer.
before you get to ask questions, you got to tell me a little bit about the school.
So we go to a very small private school up in Santa Cruz, kind of Watsonville area.
Oh.
So this actually is the entire junior and senior class at our school, so about 15 kids in each grade. And we're all part of the Values and World Thought program, like Mara said.
I think one of the things that our school keeps on telling us and trying to enforce is 3 pillars, which are academic excellence, creative self-expression, and positive character development. So academic excellence can really be found in any school. I think where our school differs is that they emphasize things like trips to increase your awareness of your values, and they emphasize performing arts to increase your public speaking skills. So it's really not just about the academics at our school, it's also about how you express yourself and encouraging creativity. So
Very interesting. And my guess is your member of Congress is either Sam Farr. It is Sam Farr.
Sam Farr, yeah.
Okay. All right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
We read that you were a volunteer for Vista in Baltimore, and I wanted to know how that experience affected your life.
It had a lot of impacts. I grew up in sort of West Los Angeles, just part of the middle class. Father worked, mother was at home and taking care of the home, and in a relatively sort of contained world. I went to UCLA. Vista was the first chance I had to sort of live in and see directly a very different kind of life. I always thought I probably got more out of the experience that I contributed to the people I was trying to help in terms of issues, but I was just, at that point, I was a lawyer. I wasn't licensed to practice in Maryland, so I didn't practice law in that sense, but I tried to help people in the communities who had all kinds of different disputes, negotiating sort of a bill for money they owed the grocery store, utility issues, dealing with some kind of criminal activity. It was a very poor area, and in fact the area I worked in, the place I worked in, burned down 2 years after I left, because there was a riot there the night that Martin Luther King was assassinated, and so I was that area. Some of that area had to be quite rebuilt, but it was an area of East Baltimore that really was quite low income, and but you really saw a struggle for survival that you didn't normally see in the typical way that one grows up.
Hi, I'm Haley. When did you realize that you had a calling in public service?
I don't know that I thought of it as a calling in that sense. The word calling has almost like a very spiritual implication, but I was interested in sort of government, public policy, current events, history, for some reason, not particularly because my parents were involved, but just something I took to during school in Los Angeles growing up. I do have the memory of being the only person who knew Dwight Eisenhower's cabinet in the 6th grade, but I had a great civics teacher in high school who really got me interested. And when I went to UCLA, I got into the Young Democrats, and this was when John Kennedy was running for president. And then, but the thing that really triggered the interest in actually becoming a legislator was after I finished law school and before I went into Vista, I got a fellowship to go to Sacramento for 10 months and work for the legislature. And that was also an important part of my experience. One, it's where I first sort of really hooked up with a lot of issues affecting farm workers and migrant workers in California, which became something I, to this day, still interests me and I'm involved with, even though my district is totally an urban congressional district. But secondly, it made me realize that within the legislative process, if you set your mind to it, you can make incremental changes that can make life better for people, and that. So part of it was what you could do and accomplish in that process, and part of it was, to be honest with you, the puzzle of figuring out how to do those things also fascinated me, and so then I went on to Vista and had those experiences, then practiced law for a while, and then ran for the state assembly based on primarily my interest in politics and in public policy, and the firsthand experience of watching the state legislature in action.
I'm Mara again. When I met you at the inauguration last year, everyone was really happy and optimistic about the future. And I was wondering, now that we're into the hard work of actually legislating that change, if you feel that we're fulfilling the promise of that time.
In some fundamental way, I do. The problems we were so excited about the change that we might have looked like we were discounting the magnitude of the problems. The problems are enormous. Not simply getting through the solutions to the problems, but figuring out what the solutions are. They are just enormous. And I never was under an illusion that simply having a new group come into the White House, notwithstanding the president's intelligence and sort of his perspective and all that, would allow us to just whip things through right away. That would take care of everything immediately. But I'm fundamentally an optimist. This is a really stupid job to have if you're not an optimist. If you don't think some of the seemingly intractable problems can't be solved or diluted by virtue of people trying to get something done. And I will use the tortuous, unbelievably difficult problem of healthcare as an example. And that says there are undoubtedly many flaws in this bill that we have passed, including flaws we don't even know about yet, because it's just starting to be implemented and won't be fully implemented for a few years. But since I was at UCLA, I thought, isn't it strange that this country, in a way the wealthiest, most powerful country, doesn't cover, there are people in this country who don't have health insurance. And I think Franklin Roosevelt may have made reference to it. There may have been people even before that. But my own historical thing, remembering Harry Truman calling for that in 1948. And in 2010, 62 years later, we finally passed something which is essentially, not absolutely, but essentially, a way by which every American can get health insurance at a price they can afford or through a combination of subsidies. That's a monumental achievement. That's a historic achievement. And so as the misery of watching it try to get through may have caused people to forget the nature of the accomplishment. So there is an example where actually something that's been done I think fits in with the optimism of that initial period. But watching it happen and the difficulties and all that stuff can make people forget the excitement. That was a very exciting week, that inauguration week. But that was an unrealistic high in terms of emotions. This place doesn't quite operate like that.
Hi, I'm Emily. Some of us were in South Africa last year to interview Archbishop Tutu. We are interested in what gave you the idea to support sanctions against the apartheid government in South Africa and work to get Nelson Mandela off the U.S. terrorist list.
Oh, you really? Because that latter one just was something that happened sort of quietly a year or two ago. I'm very impressed. You guys learned about that. Look, you didn't, I think I grew up sort of, my political awareness came at the same time as the civil rights movement took hold. One could not look at the practices in South Africa, whether you were in office or just a citizen, and not be repulsed by what that policy was. And when I got here, my first staffer told me about a strange situation. Ronald Reagan had become president, and he took export controls off of products going to the South African military and police, who were the enforcers of apartheid. And I put in legislation in my first few months in Congress to put those back on export controls. I'll give you the crudest example. We were exporting cattle prods to the South African Police Department, who was using those cattle prods to break up demonstrations by anti-apartheid protesters in South Africa. It later went to a much larger issue on sanctions on South Africa, where we essentially prohibited companies from investing in South Africa as long as apartheid was still the policy. Then the Europeans followed with their own sanctions, and pretty soon the South African business community, which needed investment to make money, they became a force against apartheid. Some of the same people who had been promoting and implementing the policies of apartheid became opponents of apartheid, and they pressured the government, and the government released Mandela and finally came to terms with they had an unsustainable and immoral policy, and they had to change it. And it was quite a remarkable and historic time. When I became chairman of this committee, I learned that from the time when he had been in jail and even before, he had been placed on a list of people who couldn't get visas to come to this country and had never been taken off that list. And while it was no longer relevant, because every time he wanted to come, he got a waiver and was able to come, the notion that there was some list that had his name on it was absurd. So but that was just recent. That was more getting rid of a remnant of our former policy towards South Africa many years after apartheid had ended.
Hi,
Hello.
BY. We saw a
Your name is what?
BY, just like the two
BY.
letters. Yeah.
Do I?
We saw a YouTube video where you talked about the 3 pillars of foreign policy as diplomacy, development, and defense. And yesterday we talked to...
Yeah, would you guys like to be commissioned just to write my biography?
Well, yesterday we talked to Senator Bernie Sanders, and he said one of his key principles was to help people who needed help. I'm wondering, if that is an idea that is key in the development of your foreign policy, and how that would relate to your 3 pillars.
Well, I think, this is the interesting intersection of values and interests. I think there's some fundamental values about doing something when people are dying of plagues and epidemics and civil war and brutal violence and all that. But I also think there's an argument that it's in America's interests to try and deal with issues of poverty and starvation and absence of health care, because at the long time, the conflicts that suck us into much deeper political and military kinds of problems, part of the contribution to that are these kinds of conditions. And secondly, from an economic point of view, to the extent you can give people a bigger stake in life, you can sell them more products, there's greater trade, there's greater intersection of interests. It's win-win. So in that sense, I think helping people is the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do.
Hi, I'm Emma, and we read that you believe in promoting people-to-people and two-track diplomacy in regions of conflict. Can you talk about the utility and the process of two-track diplomacy?
I'm going to give you two examples. There's a professor at UCLA who looks at the Middle East, Arab versus Israeli, Sunni versus Shia, all the different conflicts there, and you have all these formal diplomatic channels. He decided to try and get people in places of influence, journalists, government officials, not the heads of state, but people playing a role in government, in politics in these countries, in intellectuals and universities, getting them together for a more informal process of talking about their own views, exchanging ideas, building a framework that could hopefully at some point bring pressure on the leaders to resolve conflicts. And he did this in the Middle East. It's sort of an expensive program because you have to they meet 3 or 4 times a year. I've been to one of those meetings and it's quite remarkable. You're sitting there, Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians, Israelis, Americans, some Europeans, and they organize these different areas of conflict, peace, water rights, nuclear and proliferation issues, and they start talking about them and different ways to solve them. And it's hard to have precise measurements of its direct contribution to the solutions, but it seems logical to me to think that that kind of interaction creates relationship. And frequently the people who are at those meetings in 5 years, they're in really high positions in government, and they now have the contacts and relationships and some of the ideas that come out of those meetings, and they're in a position to oppose them. And I frequently try to meet with people myself who, from some of these areas in more informal settings, even where we don't have diplomatic relations, to get a little sense of where they're coming from and sort of try to make clear where I'm coming from on some of the issues where we have very big disagreements.
Hi, I'm Danny. You have an extraordinary career, and do you think that you could give us some advice for those of us that are embarking on the next big step in our life?
Well, as a general rule, I would argue that it's really good to go into an area where what you're going to be doing that day makes you want to get up in the morning and get to work. I mean, you're going to have to one way or another to feed yourself. But I think the life becomes much more interesting and meaningful if you're doing something you like doing and it motivates you. And there is nothing about this job. No, the people are not in front of my house every 2 years demanding that I run for this office. It's an office I keep deciding to run for, and it has all kinds. I mean, it's a long commute to work every week, and the hours aren't very predictable, and you take a lot of verbal abuse, but you develop a thick skin, and you understand that, and but the rewards are so great that you're motivated to keep doing it, and I just think, and then once you've decided what would give you that satisfaction, then it's a little bit up to your own discipline and imagination to figure out how to get yourself in that situation and create the networks and do the networking that helps you get those positions. But I think it's an individual roadmap for everyone. There's no boilerplate thing to give you that tells you how to do it. And a lot of luck is also good. Being at the right place at the right time, those kinds of things.
Congressman Berman, I know we're at the end of your time.
But I do have to go.
Couple things, just take a couple comments about what struck you that you heard that connected with you.
I really liked what you just said about how it's an individual roadmap for everyone, because it kind of feels like you follow the best careers. Like everybody should want to be a doctor, should want to be a lawyer or a congressman, because it's the coolest thing to do, or you make the most money doing it. But
that is not the job. This is not the job. I guess for a few there might be, but not for me.
But especially the seniors in this room, are starting to learn that we have to figure out what we want to do for ourselves, and going to college, hopefully something we want to be doing.
Go ahead, Emma.
I like how you said that this is a really stupid job if you're not an optimist, because I feel like in our country a lot of times there's a lot of negative attitude, and that the government should try and have a positive outlook and just try and do the best they can.
I really liked what you said about helping people is the hard thing to do, but it's the right thing to do, because that's really true. And yeah.
Well, then my comment, I guess, would be that if part of what you're doing at the school is figuring out how to be well prepared for what you're prepared to do, and that point that you mentioned earlier about the ability to express yourself, the school's succeeding. Because you guys really came here. I mean, I got people who are juniors and seniors like me with wandering through here because that's what's on the school program to come to Washington, and you could tell they just wish they were somewhere else. That is not the feeling I got from you guys, and it sounds like you invested a fair amount of time in this trip before you actually took it. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
When we were talking about being in Congress and the whether he thinks that we're fulfilling the promise of how good we felt when Obama was inaugurated, he said that he was never under the misconception that there weren't big problems, because the magnitude of the problems we're facing are so huge. And so when he was elected, it was unrealistic because it was such a happy time. But he was also saying that to be in Congress, you have to be optimistic. Otherwise, it's a stupid job to take. So he was very quiet and humble, and he was very practical but idealistic as well.
Once we showed him how much we knew and how much we had put into it, I think he really enjoyed it and was appreciative of it. I really enjoyed the interview, and I think he did too. So.